Hello, my name is John Arden, and I'm very happy and honored to participate in this Armenian conference. And in fact, despite the fact that my last name is Arden, my father's name before he changed it was Barasadian, and my mother's maiden name was Bogosian. Um, so, what I'd like to present in this conference is a study that took place in the organization I used to work in, Kaiser Permanente. It was the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. And that study has morphed into multiple studies throughout the world. What I'm going to focus on in this presentation is how ACEs, Adverse Childhood Experiences, actually result in multiple health problems throughout one's life, but not necessarily. Not everybody that experiences ACEs experiences multiple health problems later in life. So uh, let's first get a picture of what the ACE study was all about. So Vince Folletti, the principal investigator in this study, was quite interested in obesity, actually, back in the 1980s. And he was rather curious about how some people that came to him for screening uh, happened to have multiple problems earlier in life. So the next decade, by the late 1990s, he decided to enlist some people at the Center for Disease Control, such as Robert Ananda and others, in a very large study that encompassed over 17,000 patients. And what they did was they presented questionnaires to people. Uh, and these questionnaires asked questions about what their early life was like. And they categorized ACEs as um, uh, types of adverse childhood experiences. For example, if you experience child abuse during, let's say, your childhood and later your adolescence, in two different incidents, that's still one ACE, so it's child abuse. If your father was an alcoholic, that's one ACE there. So let's say he beat you up, that's two ACEs. And what if you were subject to witnessing domestic violences? There's three ACEs and so on. So what they did was they added up the ACEs and then they correlated those ACEs with poor outcomes that occurred throughout one's life. And because he was initially quite interested in obesity, he found, and they found together, that the prevalence rate for obesity went up with every ACE. So if you had four ACEs, you had a higher incidence of obesity. Uh, what about suicide? Well, of course, more ACEs, more difficulty controlling your emotions, more difficulty feeling safe, and so on. And so the acting out behaviors seem to go up as well. Uh, and lifetime history of depression seemed to go up as a stepwise increase for depression. Now you see the difference between men and women. We know that women outnumber men 2 to 1 for depression. That's why the difference there. Well, drug abuse also seemed to go up. And what I don't have in this slide that was actually downloaded from the Center for Disease Control is the type of drugs used. But nevertheless, you get the idea that with every ACE, there's an increase of chance of engaging in various types of drug use. Smoking and lung disease also go up with every ACE and an astronomical increase with over 4 or 5 ACEs, certainly over 5 ACEs. And this has always been a big concern in the health field probably for about 150 years or even more, because at one point after the American Civil War, there was noted to be a great increase in cardiovascular problems of these young men returning from war in their 20s. So high levels of cortisol and so on, but that's not the only thing. And we're going to be talking about the immune system and epigenetics and a number of other factors in a few minutes. Uh, well, uh, greater number of ACEs associated with some risky, uh, um, sexually promiscuous, not safe sex types of outcomes with HIV incidents. Uh, and so if you have multiple ACEs, uh, your chance of dying earlier than people with fewer ACEs is rather startling. In fact, some studies indicate that you'll die 20 years before people without ACEs if you've got 4 ACEs. And what I want to center on in terms of this uh, presentation is the multiple ripple effects through one's experience in the health arena, which of course affect the brain, which of course affect cognition and affect regulatory skills and so on. So that's rather startling. You die 20 years before people with no ACEs. Doesn't necessarily mean that that is the case, because we know that people such as Beethoven, for example, had at least 3, perhaps 4 ACEs. He lived to 56, created all sorts of amazing music that was very, very prefrontal cortex oriented. And we're going to get into the issue of prefrontal cortex activation in a few minutes. So let's talk about the multiple ripple effects that we've noted. It's quite evident now in the fields of psychology and psychiatry and healthcare in general that there are multiple feedback loops that make us who we are. We in the 21st century are looking for integration, and what I mean by integration is the focus on how all these self-sustaining, self-generating feedback loops create something greater than each one of them individually. So everything starts with ATP, our principal energy base that's created through our mitochondria. And in fact, genes, which used to get a heck of a lot of press, but thanks to the new field of epigenetics, we know that genes aren't necessarily destiny. Rather, your behavior and your experience have a lot to do with what genes are expressed and what genes are not expressed. Your immune system is terribly important with regard to your ability to create clarity of thought without cognitive fog and blue moods and everything else. And in the field of stress and trauma, we know that your ability to have shock absorbers, to have durability, is now referred to as allostasis instead of stress. Stress is an old term used by Hans Selye, and that's rather a rigid term borrowed from the field of engineering. So what you don't want is allostatic load, and many of our relatives, in fact, had a great degree of allostatic load, having suffered the genocide and everything following. And all these ripple effects through these feedback loops affect the multiple memory systems, not just the 2 categories, implicit and explicit memory, but the multiple systems within each broad long-term memory capacity. And then, what the heck is the mind? Well, in this presentation, I'm not going to get into great detail, but we know that the mind is not necessarily one thing. It's really the feedback loop between states of mind that can be identified through various networks in the brain, and there are 3 that are getting a heck of a lot of press right now, including the executive network, the default mode network, and the salience network. So let's start with mitochondria. So every one of our cells contain mitochondria. The high energy consumers in our body, the heart, the liver, and the brain have the highest number of mitochondria that produce ATP. In fact, the brain requires roughly hundreds of mitochondria in every cell to produce the capacity to have clarity of thought and skills to regulate your durability through stressful times and so on. Unfortunately, many people who have experienced a great degree of um, let's say stress, we're going to use that euphemistic term, through their lifetime, starting through the ACEs, uh, might have some lifestyle factors that render their mitochondria less capable of producing ATP. And in fact, because they perhaps have a very poor diet, don't exercise very much, they're blowing out their mitochondria. And as a result of blowing out their mitochondria, they typically have greater degree of ROS, free radicals like superoxide and so on, that can impair the cells, brain cells, other cells in their body, and also blow out their mitochondria themselves. And we know certainly that mitochondria have their own DNA. And so what we're talking about here is people who have a lot of ACEs might have a tendency to have less energy, have less of capacity to be able to focus. We're going to get a little bit more into this in terms of child abuse and what structure of the brain looks like and so on. What about epigenetics? Well, thanks to the Human Genome Project, which was an internationally focused endeavor with thousands of participants, we know that we have far fewer genes than we ever assumed. We thought we'd have roughly about 200,000 or 100,000, excuse me, and it turns out we only have about 24,000, maybe 22 to 25, and that was a shock because other species, such as a worm, has roughly about the same number of genes. Well, that's shocking, and a tomato actually has more genes. Wait a minute. So that was quite startling for us. But what was really fascinating was that when we identified what a gene is, we discovered that of our DNA, only 2% of our DNA can be described as a gene. So what the heck is a gene? A gene is a section of your DNA that codes for amino acids that get combined together to make proteins. That's what genes do. They don't make disorders. They don't make diseases and all that in that sort of rigid sort of outcome way. We have 98% of our DNA non-coding. It used to be called junk DNA, but we know that it's not junk DNA. So we have a whole lot more non-coding DNA than other species, which actually allows us to be far more malleable and adaptive to different environments, which is a good thing or a bad thing. Well, how does this happen? Well, we know that these protein bodies, these histones, can be unwrapped or kept from unwrapping by acetylation or methylation. Methylation is the suppression, acetylation is the unwrapping. So in other words, your experience has this epigenetic effect whereby genes are expressed or suppressed. And we know that thanks to a number of studies, beginning at McGill University in Canada and other places, that good parenting, uh, good nurturance, and so on results in better affect regulation. In fact, that was just a theory by John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth and others. Now we know from the epigenetic research that they were right. So, for example, early secure attachment results in better expression of the cortisol receptors for your affect regulation that are centered in your hippocampus and your hypothalamus, which gives you a better thermostat. Now, that's an interesting metaphor that John Bowlby used. So, secure attachment results in better thermostat function. So, in other words, you're more durable, less likely to experience agitation if you experience some stress. And so, how does this work? Well, it turns out that the decrease in methylation, now remember methylation is the suppression of the expression of genes. So the unwrapping of the histones makes it more possible for these cortisol receptor genes to make more receptors in your hippocampus and your hypothalamus, which can turn off your HPA axis, your hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. So there you got it. There's your thermostat. And so secure attachment provides growing children with better durability to difficult situations, more shock absorbers, so to speak. Unfortunately, uh, the lack of it, more ACEs, for example, results in less expression of the cortisol receptor gene, and these kids who have multiple ACEs early in life are more likely to overreact to some situations that other people might regard as just normal life experiences. And not only are there less cortisol receptors in these areas of the brain, the hippocampus, the hypothalamus, but also there's a ramping up of the CRH genes and so on. And as a result, instead of just not providing the brakes to the HPA axis, there's a ramping up. So in other words, they're more likely to respond with hypervigilance and more stress than people with security. Now, so genes aren't just an on or off kind of thing. It's more like a volume dial. And also, we know that a lot of people in the healthcare industry, certainly mental health, had these silly ideas that there's a depression gene and an anxiety gene and so on. So let's take a look at what was once regarded as the depression gene. This is a short version of serotonin transporter gene. So if you've got that and you've had a chaotic early environment, let's say a lot of ACEs, you might be more likely to experience depression and so on. However, what if you've got the short version of serotonin transporter gene and you had secure attachment? Actually, you're better off than people that don't have the short version of the serotonin transporter gene. So it's not a depression gene. Perhaps it helps a person better adapt to whatever conditions occur in that early environment. Well, what about telomeres? Well, a lot of press on telomeres in the last 15, 20 years. In fact, Helen Blackburn won the Nobel Prize for her discovery of how telomerase works. And these are sections of your chromosomes that are non-coding DNA that protect it from mutation and so on. We know that bad experiences early on, poor self-care, shrink telomeres, which make you more likely to have difficulties with mutations and so on, more illness. So let's focus on the immune system. The immune system isn't necessarily just in the various areas that have been traditionally called part of your immune system, like your lymphs and so on, your thymus and everything. Sure, those are very critical parts of your immune system, but you also have immune cells in your brain, such as the microglial cells. So if you even have inflammation in your gut, your brain is going to respond through the release of pro-inflammatory cytokines. Cytokines are these immune messengers. You can have pro-inflammatory or anti-inflammatory cytokines. And so that's been a big focus in the fields of psychiatry and psychology since the late 1990s. And so we know through the field that I've been very excited about, called psychoneuroimmunology, that stress can impair your immune system in part, not only because of the extra release of cortisol, which dampens down immune functions, but also the inflammatory cycle as well. And so these pro-inflammatory cytokines, abbreviated here as PICs, um, uh, can impair the quality and the clarity of thought. We certainly know this through the whole COVID crisis that we're experiencing globally right now, that people complain about cognitive fog and so on. This is largely about the um, inflammation in the brain. Now, if you experience multiple ACEs early in life, then you are more likely to have inflammation in your brain. And so the combination of all these factors can make it more difficulty to focus and regulate your affect. And in fact, when you get it out of control through bad lifestyle practices, you can have inflammation in your gut. You can have leaky gut syndrome because your gut bacteria is all messed up. With more firmicutes as opposed to bacteriotes, have leaky gut, signaling your microglial in your brain to turn on pro-inflammatory cytokines, and then you're going to have cognitive fog. So inflammation is a major factor in the whole sequence of ACEs and poor mental health and general health outcomes. So chronic inflammation, again, not only affects one's joints and lethargy and so on, but cognitive fog and depression. Well, how does this work out for adolescents and uh, children, in fact? Well, we know that unfortunately, because of poor lifestyle practices in the Western world, the incidence of obesity has been going up dramatically. And with obesity, with extra fat cells, what we find is the release of pro-inflammatory cytokines, which increases the long-term experience of chronic inflammation, which gives you blue moods and difficulty focusing. And that's partly related to the fact that extra fat cells circle other fat cells and you can't clear them out. The immune system gets turned on inappropriately, meaning your first line of defense in your innate immune system is inflammation. And so extra fat cells causes inflammation, and we have a crisis globally with childhood and adolescent obesity. Uh, and then you can be on the fast track to develop diabetes type 2, and we see that increase dramatically globally. Certainly in the United States, Europe, and to some degree in Armenia as well. And so we know that with diabetes type 2, there's a strong correlation between depression, anxiety, and in fact, if you've had a traumatic experience, you're more likely to develop diabetes type 2. And if you had diabetes type 2, you're more likely to over-respond to any traumatic experiences. And as a result, we see actual brain shrinkage with diabetes. This is quite shocking to the healthcare community. Uh, so this slide sort of summarizes all this. So you start out with a lot of ACEs. You don't take care of yourself. You eat a lot of junk, let's say, simple carbohydrates and trans fatty acids, fried foods, and so on. You don't exercise. You're going to get inflammation in your gut. You're going to get inflammation throughout your body. You're going to perhaps even have a leaky gut syndrome, pro-inflammatory cytokines in your brain, and so on. You can get blue mood. So, with all that in consideration, through adolescence, what we find is multiple challenges, multiple developmental factors colliding with poor lifestyle practices. So we know that prefrontal cortex, for example, is going through this massive reorganization. Up to 50% of the synapses in the prefrontal cortex are pruned away. There's incredible myelination occurring up through and into the mid 20s. And if you're using a lot of substances and not taking care of yourself, perhaps associated with a lot of ACEs, then you might have difficulty developing the capacity to create new cells called neurogenesis in your hippocampus and so on. So you have a bog down in your hippocampus, like the librarian in your brain, instead of more cells. So the prefrontal cortex, and specifically the dorsal outer prefrontal cortex, is a fancy way of saying top to the side, is the last to mature in the brain. But a lot of people, unfortunately, slow that development up or impair that development. This is the capacity to keep in mind for 20 to 30 seconds anything. We call it working memory, for example, or this executive control system. And the orbital frontal cortex, your affect regulatory capacity, can also be impaired. So this massive reorganization, this massive development early in adolescence all the way into the 20s can be impaired if you start off with a lot of ACEs, don't take care of yourself through childhood and adolescence, and impair the prefrontal cortex. And so why is that so important? Well, this is when a lot of, let's just generally call it executive control functions develop, our ability to kind of navigate through a complex world. And if our prefrontal cortex is impaired through that process, that adaptation is going to be incredibly difficult. And so relative to adults, we have long talked about how adolescents do a little bit more drama to create some kind of reaction within themselves. That they have to do more to get a dopamine release. That's why adolescents like the scary movies more, the roller coasters, and so on. And so what we see is this organization change. So the pruning starts in the back and then ends in the front, so to speak. And after a period of time, this infrastructure of affect regulation and the ability to feel calm and positive within yourself can be impaired because it's not just one thing. It's just not all about cortisol. It's about your immune system. It's about gene expression. It's about your mitochondria and so on. It's about all these feedback loops together. And if you experience deprivation early on, then areas of your brain can not develop. And we know this from multiple studies that relate to these orphanages, beginning certainly in Romania, but we know that throughout the Eastern Bloc countries, there were a number of orphanages, and the prefrontal cortex, top side of both slides, doesn't develop as well as the so-called normal, which is the brain on the left. So the one on the right is the deprived brain. And child abuse does the same thing, even worse. There's more affect asymmetry. In other words, underdevelopment in the left prefrontal cortex, overdevelopment of the right, which is strongly associated with anxiety and depression. And here you see it in this slide with the one on the right is the abused kid. More activity when there is activity in the prefrontal cortex. The bottom part of both slides are the occipital lobes, so both individuals are seeing something, but the one on the left, which is the so-called normal one, is deciding what to do. So we know that if you are the child of somebody that's already depressed, then you're more likely to develop this affect asymmetry, more activity on the right than the left, less dopamine, less serotonin, and so on. So in other words, you have a lot of ACEs, and one of the ACEs is somebody in your family, maybe your mother, maybe your father, is seriously depressed. So, what is the solution here? Well, what we need to do is promote good lifestyle practices. And these good lifestyle practices I put in the mnemonic seeds, which um, really encode these five: social, exercise, education, diet, and sleep. And that's not hard to remember when you think about planting and cultivating seeds over a lifetime. Our job is to promote a model that people can remember. And planting seeds over a lifetime from childhood throughout actually is a good longevity practice in general. So we, as healthcare professionals, need to bring things down to earth with our clients so they'll remember, rather than this little 50-minute or 15-minute section of time that we see with people. So um, uh, thank you for attending. I very much appreciate being part of this conference. My email address is at the top, and my website is at the bottom. And you probably know this image quite well. That's Mount Ararat and Khor Varhop as well. So take care.